Throughout human history, few figures have achieved the singularity of Solomon, the man chosen by God to reign over the prosperous kingdom of Israel and whose wisdom was unparalleled. His name echoes as a synonym for intelligence and discernment. His words have shaped generations, and his deeds elevated Israel to a status of splendor and admiration. But Solomon's story is not just a tale of greatness, it is also a cautionary one, showing how even the most precious gifts can be corrupted by disobedience and the subtle allure of idols. Solomon began his journey with a heart inclined toward God, but ended his days torn between worshipping the Lord and the idols he introduced by allowing foreign influences into his life. His life is a theological masterpiece, illustrating the depth of the wisdom that comes from God and the emptiness of human ambitions detached from obedience. He built a temple that became the dwelling place of God, but also planted the seeds of Israel's division. This is a story of glory and downfall, of redemption sought but incomplete. In this narrative, we will explore the events that marked Solomon's rise, his extraordinary wisdom, and the spiritual decline that marred his later years. As we proceed, we will reflect on divine warnings and the lessons his life offers us today, inviting us to seek faithfulness to the eternal God above all. Solomon's reign emerged during one of the most stable and promising periods in Israel's history. After the intense battles that marked the reign of his father, King David, Israel was finally unified and its borders consolidated. David, the man after God's own heart, prepared the way for Solomon's reign, desiring to build a temple for the Lord but being prevented due to the wars of his time, 1 Chronicles 28:3. Instead, he was promised that his son would succeed him, establish the throne forever and build the house of the Lord. Solomon ascended the throne under circumstances that required discernment and authority, even in the face of challenges such as the intrigues involving Adonijah, his brother Solomon, demonstrated political wisdom and firmness, 1 Kings 2. Before he even began his work, his ascension was seen as the direct fulfillment of the promise made to David in 2 Samuel 7:12-13. God was clearly with him, establishing a kingdom that not only brought peace, but also became a living testimony to divine faithfulness. One of the most remarkable and revealing moments of Solomon's early reign was his visit to Gibeon, where he offered sacrifices to the Lord and had a celestial vision. In an encounter with God, he could have asked for anything, riches, power, or the defeat of his enemies. Yet Solomon, recognizing his youth and the great responsibility he bore, asked for wisdom to govern God's people with justice and discernment. This request pleased the Lord so greatly that he granted Solomon not only unparalleled wisdom, but also riches and honor that would surpass any other king of his time, 1 Kings 3:5-13. One of the first acts that demonstrated the wisdom granted to Solomon by God was his judgment between two women disputing the maternity of a baby, 1 Kings 3:16-28. This episode captured the essence of his divine discernment. By proposing to divide the child in half, he revealed the true mother's love, who preferred to relinquish her son rather than see him die. This judgment not only consolidated Solomon's authority, but also brought fear and admiration to the people of Israel, who recognized that he ruled with God's wisdom. Solomon used his wisdom not only in individual judgments, but also in governing the kingdom. He reorganized Israel's administration, establishing 12 regional officials responsible for providing food for the royal court, 1 Kings 4:7. This structure brought efficiency and order to a kingdom that flourished under his leadership. Israel experienced peace as never before, described as a nation where each person could sit under their vine and fig tree, a phrase symbolizing security and prosperity, 1 Kings 4:25. Solomon's greatest achievement, however, was the construction of the Temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. This project, planned by David and executed by Solomon, became Israel's spiritual center and one of the greatest works of engineering and art in antiquity. Built with precious materials such as cedar from Lebanon and pure gold, and erected by highly skilled workers, the temple was a physical manifestation of the covenant between God and Israel. Solomon led this project with zeal, dedicating it to the Lord with a prayer that acknowledged divine majesty and the necessity of obedience to the covenant. 1 Kings 8:22-53. During the temple dedication, the glory of the Lord filled the place as a cloud, signaling divine acceptance of the sacrifice and the site as his earthly dwelling. 1 Kings 8:10-11. This moment was deeply symbolic, marking the high point of Israel's relationship with God during Solomon's reign. The temple was not only a place of worship, but also a testimony to the nations that the Lord was the one true God, attracting visitors from afar to behold the site's majesty and the king's wisdom. These acts of wisdom and devotion cemented Solomon's reputation as the greatest king in Israel's history up to that point. However, even amid glory, subtle signs of deviation began to appear. The magnitude of the temple project, for example, required heavy labor and high taxes, planting the seeds of discontent that would later culminate in the kingdom's division. Despite this, the early part of his reign was a glorious reflection of divine blessing when man walks in obedience. Despite his unparalleled wisdom and initial devotion to God, Solomon gradually began to stray from the path of obedience. His spiritual decline was marked by political alliances, often solidified through marriages with foreign women. While these marriages were common for ensuring political stability, they brought devastating consequences. The introduction of idolatrous practices into Israel. The Bible emphasizes that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of whom worshipped foreign gods and turned his heart away. 1 Kings 11:1-4. Idolatry began subtly, but grew rapidly. Solomon allowed his wives to build altars for their gods, such as Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. 1 Kings 11:5-8. These practices not only corrupted the king's heart but also started to contaminate the people of Israel, who followed their leader's example. The faithfulness to the God of Israel, who had promised eternal blessings if Solomon remained obedient, was exchanged for compromises that weakened the covenant. One reason for this decline was the excessive security that prosperity brought. Surrounded by wealth and power, Solomon may have begun to rely more on his resources than on divine guidance. He violated several commandments intended for Israel's kings, such as the accumulation of excessive wealth, horses, and wives, disregarding the warnings in Deuteronomy 17:14-20. The wisdom that had once been his strength became ineffective in the face of a divided heart. God, who had revealed himself to Solomon twice, warned him about the consequences of his disobedience. 1 Kings 11:9-10. However, Solomon did not fully repent or take measures to remove idolatry from Israel. His refusal to correct his mistakes had lasting consequences, as the Lord declared that the kingdom would be taken from his lineage, though not during his lifetime, out of respect for David, his father. 1 Kings 11:11-13. This prophecy foretold the division of the kingdom, a tragedy that would mark Israel's history. The spiritual decline of Solomon serves as a powerful reminder that even the greatest gifts can be corrupted when the heart turns away from God. He began his life with a heart devoted to the Lord, but allowed personal choices to lead him away from obedience. His actions paved the way for a spiritual and moral crisis in Israel, demonstrating that wisdom without faithfulness is insufficient to sustain a life or reign that honors God. Solomon's choices in permitting idolatry had devastating impacts on Israel. As altars to foreign gods spread, the spirituality of the people began to deteriorate. Israel's covenant with the Lord, which was meant to be a model for the nations, was weakened. The nation's leaders, inspired by the king's example, began to tolerate and even practice forms of worship that contradicted the law of Moses. This spiritual corruption undermined the foundations of society, setting the stage for a divided kingdom. Idolatry brought not only spiritual decay, but also political and social instability. Solomon, who had once ruled with justice and discernment, began to lose the people's favor. High taxes to sustain his grand projects and the privileges of the royal court generated widespread dissatisfaction among the tribes of Israel. The spirit of unity painstakingly established by David, eroded, and old resentments began to surface. In his justice, God raised adversaries against Solomon during the latter years of his reign, such as Hadad the Edomite and Rezon the Syrian, 1 Kings 11:14-25. These external enemies threatened the peace Israel had enjoyed for decades. More significantly, Jeroboam, a servant of Solomon, received a prophecy from Ahijah the Shilonite that he would rule over 10 of Israel's tribes after Solomon's death, 1 Kings 11:29-31. This prophecy not only confirmed the kingdom's impending division, but also underscored the inevitable consequences of Solomon's idolatry. Though God promised to preserve a portion of the kingdom under David's lineage due to his faithfulness to his covenant, it was evident that Solomon's legacy would be marked by failure and division. The promise of eternal blessings for Israel depended on obedience to the covenant. By disobeying, Solomon paved the way for fragmentation and suffering. The glory of his reign began to crumble, and the kingdom he had ruled with wisdom was consumed by chaos. The consequences of Solomon's idolatry transcended his reign, affecting future generations. The nation that was meant to be a light to the nations became a cautionary example. Solomon's actions remind us that compromising God's commandments, even for seemingly strategic or pragmatic reasons, results in disastrous consequences. His reign, which began with so much promise, became a lesson on the cost of disobedience. The book of Ecclesiastes, attributed to Solomon, reflects a later stage of his life marked by introspection and repentance. In his words, the man once filled with wisdom and riches recognizes the futility of earthly achievements. Vanity's all is vanity, he declares at the beginning of the book, Ecclesiastes 1:2. This lament echoes the life of a man who experienced all the pleasures and accomplishments the world could offer, but found them meaningless without a solid relationship with God. Solomon explored every aspect of human existence: work, wealth, pleasures, and wisdom. He states that he sought to satisfy himself with everything his eyes desired, but ultimately discovered that none of these pursuits provided lasting fulfillment. Ecclesiastes 2:10-11. He observed that both the wise and the foolish share the same fate, death, leading him to question life's true purpose. These reflections emphasize that without an eternal perspective, even the greatest endeavors lose their meaning. A central theme of Ecclesiastes is the limitation of human wisdom. Although Solomon was the wisest man of his time, he acknowledges that earthly wisdom is insufficient to fully comprehend God's purposes. God has set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Ecclesiastes 3:11. This statement highlights the tension between humanity's desire for meaning and its inability to achieve it without divine revelation. Despite his somber view of human pursuits, Solomon concludes with a hopeful message. He declares that the best way to live is to fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Ecclesiastes 12:13. This final statement encapsulates what Solomon learned over the course of his life. Only a relationship with God can fill the void that riches, power, and pleasures cannot. Ecclesiastes offers an intimate glimpse into the mind of a man who experienced everything the world had to offer, but concluded that true satisfaction lies in reverence for God. His words remain both a warning and an invitation, a warning against the obsession with transient things and an invitation to live a life centered on the eternal purpose that only God can provide. After Solomon's death, the effects of his disobedience became dramatically evident. His son and successor, Rehoboam, inherited a kingdom already burdened by social and spiritual tensions. During his coronation, the northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, requested relief from the heavy taxation and forced labor that had supported Solomon's grand projects. 1 Kings 12:3-4. This plea was a cry of accumulated dissatisfaction during Solomon's reign, but Rehoboam, following the advice of unwise counselors, responded harshly, promising to make their burden even heavier. This thoughtless decision led to an irreversible rupture. The 10 northern tribes rejected Rehoboam's leadership and crowned Jeroboam as their king, fulfilling the prophecy given by Ahijah the Shilonite, who had torn his cloak into 12 pieces to symbolize the kingdom's division, 1 Kings 11:29-31. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming the southern kingdom, while the other tribes became the northern kingdom, also known as Israel. This division was not only political but also spiritual, as the northern kingdom soon drifted further from the worship of the true God. Jeroboam, fearing that the people of Israel might return to Jerusalem to worship at the temple, created 2 golden calves as objects of worship and placed them in Bethel and Dan, 1 Kings 12:28-30. This act of idolatry established a pattern of rebellion against God that would define the northern kingdom's history. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom retained the temple and David's lineage, but also faced significant spiritual and political challenges. The division weakened Israel as a whole, leaving it vulnerable to external enemies and further removed from God's purposes. The division of the kingdom was a direct consequence of Solomon's departure from God's ways. The United Kingdom, which had been a model of prosperity and divine wisdom, became a cautionary symbol of the dangers of disobedience and idolatry. The tribes, once united under the leadership of a king who feared the Lord, were now divided, embroiled in internal conflicts and subject to foreign invasions. The events following Solomon's death serve as a solemn reminder that no kingdom, no matter how prosperous or wise it appears, can stand firm when its spiritual foundations are compromised. The division of Israel was not only a political tragedy, but also a spiritual one, illustrating how a leader's sins can have profound and lasting consequences for an entire nation. The story of Solomon is rich with spiritual and moral lessons, with a central theme that runs throughout the narrative. Faithfulness to God is essential for true prosperity and peace. Although Solomon was blessed with unparalleled wisdom and wealth, his failure to fully obey the Lord led to spiritual decline that affected the entire nation. This underscores the importance of prioritizing a covenant relationship with God above all material gains or political alliances. Another crucial theme is the danger of gradual compromise with sin. Solomon's decline did not happen suddenly. It was a slow process marked by small concessions, such as political marriages and tolerance of idolatry. This spiritual erosion demonstrates that even the wisest and most spiritually privileged individuals are vulnerable to drifting away from God when they do not diligently guard their hearts. Proverbs 4:23. The vanity of wealth and power is another recurring theme. Despite achieving worldwide fame and amassing immeasurable riches, Solomon himself declared in Ecclesiastes that all of it was vanity and chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2:11. This teaches that no earthly pleasure can satisfy the human soul, which was created to find meaning only in God. It serves as a powerful warning against idolizing wealth and personal success. The division of the kingdom after Solomon's death also highlights the importance of responsible spiritual leadership. As a leader, Solomon not only represented Israel before God, but also directly influenced the nation's faithfulness. His failure to remain faithful to God paved the way for Israel's moral and spiritual corruption, showing that leadership without submission to God can be catastrophic. Finally, Solomon's story is a reminder of God's constant love and justice. Even in the face of the king's and the people's infidelity, God remained faithful to his covenant with David, preserving a part of the kingdom for his lineage. This divine faithfulness underscores both the seriousness of obedience and the hope of redemption, ultimately pointing to the fulfillment of God's plan in Jesus Christ, the promised descendant of David who would bring eternal salvation. Solomon's life challenges us to reflect on the centrality of obedience to God in our own lives. Even amid wisdom, success, and blessings, Solomon demonstrated that without enduring faithfulness to the Lord, even the greatest gifts can become meaningless. For us today, this means prioritizing our relationship with God above any achievements or material possessions, continually seeking His guidance in our daily decisions. The story of Solomon also serves as a warning against the gradual compromise with sin. Small moral concessions may seem insignificant, but over time they can lead our hearts away from God's purpose. This is a call to regularly examine our lives, identifying areas where we may be allowing negative influences to erode our devotion to God. Spiritual vigilance and continual repentance are essential to maintain our faithfulness. Finally, Solomon reminds us that true satisfaction does not come from wealth, knowledge, or power, but from a life lived in fear of God and obedience to His commandments. As he concludes in Ecclesiastes, "Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." Ecclesiastes 12:13. This is an invitation to live with an eternal purpose, aligning our lives with God's plans and seeking the wisdom that comes from above. The story of Solomon is a mixture of inspiration and warning. It shows us the potential of a life entrusted to God's hands, but also warns of the dangers of disobedience. May we learn from his triumphs and failures, striving to live faithfully to the Lord, trusting that His promises are true and His warnings are.